The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Marcus Thompson finished his third mile around the perimeter. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he approached the main fitness complex, his combat boots hitting the pavement with mechanical precision. After 2 tours in Afghanistan and 18 months of recovery from a leg injury that nearly ended his career, Marcus had something to prove to everyone, including himself. At 28, Marcus stood 6 feet 2 inches tall with broad shoulders and arms that showed the results of countless hours in the gym. His dark hair was cropped short in military regulation, and his steel gray eyes held a hardness that came from seeing too much combat too young. The scar running down his left leg served as a constant reminder of the IED explosion that had changed everything. As he entered the fitness facility, Marcus noticed the usual morning crowd of soldiers going through their routines. The familiar sounds of weights clanging and drill sergeants barking orders filled the air. But something caught his attention that made him stop in his tracks. Over in the corner, near the specialized training equipment used by the elite units, he saw what appeared to be a young woman instructing a group of soldiers. She couldn't have been more than 5 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her athletic build was evident even under her standard PT uniform. But what struck Marcus most was how she seemed to command respect from the hardened soldiers around her. They hung on her every word as she demonstrated proper form for a complex rope climbing technique. Marcus felt his jaw clench. This was exactly what was wrong with the modern military, he thought. Standards were being lowered, political correctness was taking over, and now they had civilians playing dress-up and pretending to train real warriors. The sight of this petite woman trying to teach battle-tested soldiers how to fight filled him with indignation. He had seen too many good men die overseas while politicians back home talked about diversity and inclusion. In his mind, combat was serious business, and there was no place for social experiments when lives were on the line. The military wasn't summer camp, and physical training wasn't a game where everyone got a participation trophy. Walking closer, Marcus could hear her voice clearly now. She spoke with authority and confidence, using technical terms that suggested genuine knowledge of combat tactics and physical conditioning. But her appearance betrayed her words in Marcus's mind. How could someone who looked like she belonged in a college classroom possibly understand what it took to survive in combat? Remember, gentlemen, she was saying to the group, the key to this technique isn't just upper body strength. It's about using your core muscles and maintaining proper breathing throughout the movement. In a real combat situation, you might need to scale a wall or rope while carrying 60 pounds of gear and fighting exhaustion. The soldiers nodded seriously, clearly respecting her instruction. Marcus noticed that several of them wore patches indicating they were part of special operations units. These weren't new recruits who might be easily impressed by fancy talk. These were experienced fighters who had earned their positions through blood, sweat, and proven ability. But Marcus couldn't get past what he saw as an obvious mismatch. In his experience, respect in the military was earned through shared hardship and proven competence in dangerous situations. He had crawled through mud under enemy fire, carried wounded comrades to safety, and made life-or-death decisions in split seconds. How could this woman, regardless of her credentials on paper, truly understand what that meant? As the group broke up to practice the technique individually, Marcus found himself walking toward where she stood. He wasn't sure what he intended to say, but something inside him demanded that he speak up. The military had been his life for over a decade, and he felt a responsibility to maintain its standards and traditions. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he had developed as a squad leader. "I couldn't help but notice your training session." The woman turned toward him with a polite but measured smile. Up close, Marcus could see that her brown eyes held an intelligence and alertness that surprised him. There was something in her gaze that suggested she was constantly analyzing and assessing, much like the look he had seen in the eyes of experienced combat veterans. "Good morning, Sergeant," she said, reading his rank from his uniform. I am Sara Michel. Was there something specific about the training that caught your attention? Her polite response only irritated Marcus further. He had expected defensiveness or perhaps some attempt to assert authority through rank or position. Instead, she seemed genuinely interested in his opinion, which somehow felt patronizing to him. Actually, Marcus replied, crossing his arms over his chest. I'm wondering what qualifies someone like you to train soldiers who might actually see combat. The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Marcus was aware that other soldiers in the vicinity had stopped their activities to listen. He didn't care. If this woman was going to play in the big leagues, she needed to be prepared for real scrutiny. Sarah's expression didn't change, but Marcus noticed that her stance shifted slightly. It was subtle, but he recognized it as the kind of unconscious movement that came from combat training. Her weight had moved to the balls of her feet, and her hands had repositioned themselves in a way that suggested she was ready to react quickly if necessary. That's a fair question, Sergeant Thompson, she said, somehow knowing his name despite the fact that he hadn't introduced himself. Physical training and combat preparation are serious responsibilities, and every instructor should be held accountable for their methods and qualifications. Her response caught him off guard. Not only had she somehow identified him by name, but she had acknowledged the validity of his challenge without becoming defensive. Most civilians would have either backed down or become indignant when questioned by a soldier about military matters. You didn't answer my question, Marcus pressed, sensing that she was trying to deflect. What's your combat experience? Where have you served? What gives you the right to stand there and tell warriors how to prepare for battle? The other soldiers had definitely stopped their activities now. Marcus could feel their attention focused on this confrontation, and he was committed to seeing it through. In his mind, this was about more than just one instructor. This was about maintaining the integrity of military training and ensuring that soldiers received instruction from people who truly understood the stakes involved. Sarah seemed to consider her words carefully before responding. When she spoke again, her voice remained calm and professional, but Marcus detected something else beneath the surface. It was the kind of controlled intensity he had seen in Special Forces operators when they were deciding how much information to reveal about their backgrounds. My qualifications come through practical experience and proven results, Sergeant, she said. I've developed training protocols that have prepared soldiers for some of the most challenging missions our military undertakes. The men you saw here today aren't beginners. They're experienced operators who return to my programs because they've seen the effectiveness of these methods in real-world situations. It was another non-answer, Marcus thought, and his frustration grew. Why couldn't she just admit that she was a civilian contractor who had learned everything from books and videos? Why the elaborate dance around simple questions about her background? Look, Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. I'm not trying to be difficult here, but I've buried too many good soldiers to watch some fitness instructor play games with combat training. These men deserve better than theoretical knowledge from someone who's never had bullets flying over their head. As soon as the words left his mouth, Marcus noticed something change in Sarah's demeanor. The polite professionalism remained, but there was now a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. It was a look he recognized from his own mirror on difficult days, the expression of someone who had indeed faced life-threatening situations and survived them. I understand your concerns, Sergeant Thompson, she said, her voice taking on a slightly different quality. The responsibility for training soldiers who will face combat is not something I take lightly. Every technique I teach, every principle I share, has been tested under conditions where failure means death. There was something in the way she said those last words that gave Marcus pause. It wasn't the dramatic flourish of someone trying to sound impressive. It was the quiet certainty of someone stating a simple fact based on personal experience. But Marcus was too invested in his position to back down now. In his mind, he was fighting for something important, defending the standards and traditions that had kept him alive through multiple deployments. He couldn't let this go without getting real answers. Tested by who? He challenged. Where? When? I'm not asking for classified information, just basic credentials. If you're going to train my fellow soldiers, I think we have a right to know what makes you qualified. The confrontation had drawn the attention of nearly everyone in the facility now. Marcus was aware of their audience, but he felt justified in his questioning. This was exactly the kind of accountability that the military needed more of, in his opinion. Sarah stood quietly for a moment, seeming to weigh her options. Marcus could see her evaluating the situation, taking in the crowd of observers and considering her response. When she finally spoke, her words were measured and deliberate. "Sergeant Thompson, I respect your service and your concern for your fellow soldiers. That kind of dedication to your brothers in arms is exactly what makes our military strong." She paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. However, there are aspects of military service and training that operate under different parameters than traditional unit structures. Marcus felt his patience wearing thin. More deflection, more vague references to mysterious qualifications that couldn't be discussed. In his experience, people who really had impressive credentials weren't shy about sharing them when directly challenged. "Either you have combat experience or you don't," Marcus said bluntly. "Either you serve in hostile territory or you haven't. Either you understand what these men will face in the field, or you're just another civilian contractor making money off military contracts." The accusation hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Marcus had essentially called her a fraud in front of a room full of soldiers, and he knew there was no taking it back. But he felt that his point needed to be made, even if it meant creating an uncomfortable situation. What happened next surprised everyone in the room, including Marcus. Instead of becoming angry or defensive, Sarah smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile or an amused smile. It was the kind of smile that Marcus had seen on the faces of his most dangerous enemies just before they made a move that changed everything. "Sergeant Thompson," she said, her voice now carrying an edge that hadn't been there before, "I think there might be some value in demonstrating rather than explaining my qualifications." Before Marcus could ask what she meant, Sarah had moved toward a nearby training mat and gestured for him to follow. The other soldiers quickly formed a circle around them, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "If you're questioning my ability to prepare soldiers for combat," Sarah continued, "then perhaps you'd be willing to participate in a practical demonstration of combat preparedness training." Marcus felt a moment of uncertainty. This wasn't what he had expected. He had anticipated that his direct challenge would either force her to admit her limitations or reveal her actual qualifications. Instead, she seemed to be suggesting some kind of physical competition or demonstration. "What kind of demonstration?" Marcus asked, his military training making him wary of unclear tactical situations. "Nothing complicated," Sarah replied, beginning to stretch in a way that suggested she was preparing for physical activity. "Just a simple exercise in hand-to-hand combat techniques. Since you're concerned about my ability to teach soldiers how to handle themselves in dangerous situations, this should give you a clear indication of my practical knowledge." Marcus felt the weight of the room's attention on him. He had initiated this confrontation, and now he was being offered the chance to prove his point through direct action. Every instinct told him that this was a bad idea, but his pride and his genuine beliefs about military standards wouldn't let him back down. "Fine," he said, moving onto the mat. "But I want everyone here to understand that I'm not doing this to show off or prove anything personal. This is about maintaining standards and ensuring that our soldiers get the best possible training." As Marcus positioned himself on the training mat, he tried to assess what he was walking into. Sarah was smaller than him by several inches and at least 40 pounds. He had extensive hand-to-hand combat training from the Army, plus additional experience from real-world situations where fighting skills had been necessary for survival. But there was something about Sarah's movements as she prepared that bothered him. She moved with the kind of fluid precision that suggested extensive martial arts training, and her positioning indicated that she understood concepts like leverage and momentum that went beyond basic military combatives. "The objective is simple," Sarah explained to the gathered soldiers. This is a demonstration of practical self-defense and combat techniques that might be useful in close-quarter situations where weapons aren't available or practical. Marcus nodded, settling into a fighting stance he had learned through years of training and experience. He had no intention of seriously hurting this woman, but he also wasn't going to let her embarrass him or make a mockery of military combat training. "Ready when you are," he said, trying to project confidence while privately hoping that this would end quickly and without anyone getting seriously hurt. What happened in the next 30 seconds changed everything Marcus thought he knew about combat, training, and the woman standing across from him on that mat. The moment Marcus moved forward, everything changed. He had intended to make his point with a controlled demonstration, perhaps a simple takedown that would prove his superior size and strength without causing serious harm. But as soon as he committed to his first movement, Sarah disappeared. 1 second, she was standing directly in front of him, and the next second, Marcus found himself face down on the training mat with his arm twisted behind his back in a position that sent shooting pain through his shoulder. The entire sequence had happened so quickly that the watching soldiers barely had time to register what they had witnessed. "Yield," Sarah asked calmly, applying just enough pressure to make it clear that she could cause serious damage if she chose to. Marcus's mind reeled as he tried to process what had just happened. He had thrown thousands of punches in training, fought hand-to-hand with enemy combatants who were fighting for their lives, and survived close-quarters combat situations that had broken lesser men. But he had never encountered anything like the speed and precision that Sarah had just demonstrated. "Ow!" he gasped, tapping the mat to signal submission. Sarah immediately released the hold and stepped back, offering her hand to help him up. As Marcus accepted her assistance and got back to his feet, he noticed that she wasn't even breathing hard. Whatever she had just done to him had required no visible effort on her part. "Leverage and timing," she said simply, as if she had just demonstrated a basic math problem rather than completely dismantling a trained combat veteran in front of a room full of witnesses. Marcus rubbed his shoulder and tried to salvage some dignity from the situation. Around them, the other soldiers were murmuring among themselves, clearly impressed by what they had seen, but also respectful enough not to make jokes at his expense. "That was luck," Marcus said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they sounded hollow. "Let's try that again." Sarah regarded him with what might have been sympathy. "Sergeant Thompson, I think you've made your point about the importance of proper qualifications. Perhaps we should—" "Again," Marcus interrupted, moving back into a fighting stance. His pride was wounded, but more than that, he needed to understand what had just happened. In his experience, combat was about strength, endurance, and aggression. The techniques Sarah had used seemed to violate everything he understood about physical confrontation. This time, Marcus approached more cautiously. Instead of trying to overwhelm her with a direct attack, he circled to her left, looking for an opening while maintaining a defensive position. He had learned hard lessons about underestimating opponents, and he wasn't going to make that mistake twice. Sarah waited patiently, her stance relaxed but balanced. She tracked his movement without seeming tense or aggressive, like a chess master watching an amateur struggle with an opening they had seen 1,000 times before. When Marcus finally committed to his attack, he used a combination of techniques designed to prevent the kind of countermove she had used before. He feinted high, then drove low, attempting to use his weight advantage to take her down through pure force. The result was even more humiliating than the first exchange. Not only did Sarah avoid his attack entirely, but she somehow used his own momentum against him, sending him sliding across the mat in a direction he hadn't intended to go. He managed to avoid falling completely, but only by executing an awkward roll that left him dizzy and disoriented. "Sergeant," Sarah said, and this time her voice carried a note of genuine concern, "you're going to hurt yourself if you keep this up." Marcus stood slowly, his equilibrium still off from the unexpected tumble. Around him, he could see the faces of his fellow soldiers, and what he saw there wasn't mockery or amusement. Instead, he saw the kind of serious attention that soldiers reserved for demonstrations of genuine tactical skill. "What are you?" Marcus asked, abandoning any pretense that this was still about proving a point. "What kind of training produces that level of skill?" For the first time since their confrontation began, Sarah seemed to hesitate. She glanced around the room at the watching soldiers, then back at Marcus with an expression that suggested she was making a difficult decision. "My background is specialized," she said carefully. "I work with units that require training beyond standard military parameters." It was still a non-answer, but Marcus was beginning to understand that her evasiveness might have nothing to do with embarrassment about civilian status. The techniques she had used on him were unlike anything in standard Army combatives training. They were too precise, too refined, and too effective to be the product of civilian martial arts classes or theoretical study. "Special forces?" Marcus asked, though even as he said it, he knew it didn't quite fit. He had worked with special forces operators before, and while they were certainly formidable fighters, what he had just experienced seemed to be on a different level entirely. Sarah's smile returned, but this time it seemed more genuine and less mysterious. "Something like that," she said. Before Marcus could press for more specific information, a new voice cut through the murmur of conversation in the room. "Problem here, Mitchell." Everyone turned toward the source of the voice. Standing in the doorway was a man in his early 40s with the kind of bearing that immediately identified him as senior military personnel. His uniform showed the rank of Master Chief Petty Officer, and the patches on his sleeve indicated Navy Special Warfare. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Navy Special Warfare meant SEALs, and SEALs didn't usually show up at Army training facilities unless something very important was happening. "No problem, Master Chief," Sarah replied. "Just demonstrating some basic techniques for interested personnel." The Master Chief's gaze moved from Sarah to Marcus, taking in a slightly disheveled appearance and the obvious signs of recent physical activity. When he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of authority that made everyone in the room stand a little straighter. "Sergeant Thompson, isn't it?" he said, apparently recognizing Marcus from some previous encounter or briefing. "I understand you've been asking questions about qualifications and credentials." "Yes, Master Chief," Marcus replied, not sure whether he was in trouble or simply being acknowledged. "Good," the Master Chief said, surprising everyone present. "That's exactly the kind of scrutiny our training programs should receive. Soldiers have a right to know that their instructors are qualified to prepare them for real-world situations." He stepped further into the room, and Marcus could see that he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had seen extensive combat and lived to tell about it. The scars visible on his hands and forearms suggested someone who had been in the kinds of situations where survival depended on skill, training, and quick thinking. "Mitchell here has been working with my teams for the past 3 years, the Master Chief continued. In that time, she's developed training protocols that have saved lives in some of the most challenging operational environments our people face. Marcus felt the pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place, but the picture they were forming was not what he had expected. If Sarah was working directly with SEAL teams, that meant her background was far more specialized than anything he had imagined. "What kind of operations?" Marcus asked, his earlier antagonism now replaced by genuine curiosity. The Master Chief and Sarah exchanged a look that clearly communicated something beyond words. When a Master Chief spoke again, his tone suggested that he was sharing information that wasn't normally discussed in open forums. "The kind of operations where traditional military training isn't sufficient," he said. "The kind of missions where our people need to be prepared for scenarios that aren't covered in standard tactical manuals." Marcus was beginning to understand that he had stumbled into something much more complex than a simple question about instructor qualifications. The evasiveness he had interpreted as deception was actually operational security, and the techniques that had seemed impossibly advanced were apparently standard for a level of military activity he hadn't been aware of. "I think I owe you an apology," Marcus said to Sarah, his earlier certainty about her credentials now seeming embarrassingly misguided. "No apology necessary," Sarah replied. Your questions were legitimate, and your concern for your fellow soldiers is exactly the kind of dedication we need more of. But Marcus wasn't ready to let it go. The demonstration on the mat had shown him capabilities that went far beyond anything in his own training, and he needed to understand what he had witnessed. Those techniques you used, he said, where do they come from? I've never seen anything like them in Army combatives or even in the advanced training I received as a squad leader. Sarah looked at the Master Chief, who nodded slightly, apparently giving permission for her to share more detailed information. They're adapted from multiple sources, Sarah explained. Classical martial arts, modern military close-quarters combat, psychological manipulation techniques, and improvised methods developed through trial and error in real combat situations. Trial and error? Marcus repeated. You mean you've actually used these techniques in combat? Again, the exchange of looks between Sarah and the Master Chief. When she answered, her voice carried a weight that Marcus recognized from his own memories of difficult missions. When our people are deployed in certain types of operations, they can't rely on standard protocols, she said. They might be operating alone, without backup, in situations where they need to neutralize threats quickly and silently. The techniques I teach have been field-tested under those conditions. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He was beginning to understand that Sarah's background wasn't just specialized, it was classified at a level that most military personnel never encountered. The evasiveness that had frustrated him was actually operational necessity. How long have you been doing this? He asked. Long enough to know that every soldier we train might one day depend on these skills to survive, Sarah replied. Long enough to understand that the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical experience can mean the difference between coming home alive and not coming home at all. The Master Chief stepped forward, apparently deciding that enough information had been shared for one day. Sergeant Thompson, I appreciate your concern for training standards, he said. But I want you to understand that Mitchell here has forgotten more about combat effectiveness than most people ever learn. The soldiers you saw her training earlier aren't just doing physical fitness. They're preparing for missions that require capabilities most people can't even imagine. Marcus nodded, beginning to grasp the scope of what he had witnessed. But there was still something that bothered him about the entire situation. Why all the secrecy? He asked. If her qualifications are so impressive, why not just explain that from the beginning? The Master Chief's expression grew serious. Because the moment you start talking about certain types of operations or training methods, you create security risks. The people Mitchell trains often operate in situations where their effectiveness depends on their enemies not knowing what they're capable of. It was a sobering thought. Marcus had spent his military career thinking about security in terms of protecting positions, equipment, and personnel. The idea that training methods themselves might be classified information opened up an entirely new perspective on military operations. I think I understand, Marcus said, though he suspected he was only beginning to grasp the full implications of what he had learned. I hope you do, the Master Chief replied, because what happened here today doesn't leave this room. The people who need to know about Mitchell's background already know. Everyone else gets the cover story, which is that she's a qualified fitness instructor working with various military units. Marcus looked around the room at the other soldiers who had witnessed the confrontation and demonstration. Their faces showed the same mixture of understanding and respect that he was feeling. They had all just been given a glimpse into a level of military capability that most people never suspected existed. Understood, Master Chief, Marcus said, but even as he agreed to keep the information confidential, Marcus found himself wondering about the broader implications of what he had learned. If there were training programs this advanced and operations this classified happening within the military, what else didn't he know about the organization he had devoted his life to serving? The Master Chief seemed to sense his thoughts. Sergeant, there are aspects of military service that operate on a need-to-know basis. What you need to know is that people like Mitchell are working every day to make sure our people have the best possible preparation for whatever they might face. And what they face might be more challenging than traditional combat. Marcus asked, Much more challenging, Sarah answered. The enemies our people encounter today aren't always wearing uniforms or following conventional rules of engagement. They require different skills, different mindsets, and different training methods. Marcus thought about his own combat experience and the challenges he had faced overseas. Even in traditional military operations, the situations that had tested him most severely had been the ones where standard procedures and equipment weren't sufficient. The idea that there were soldiers facing even more complex challenges was both troubling and inspiring. As the crowd of observers began to disperse and return to their regular training activities, Marcus found himself alone with Sarah and the Master Chief. The confrontation that had begun with his challenge to her credentials had evolved into something much more significant. "Sergeant," the Master Chief said, "I want you to know that your approach today, while perhaps misguided in its assumptions, showed exactly the kind of critical thinking and protective instinct that we value in military personnel." "Thank you, Master Chief," Marcus replied, though he still felt somewhat embarrassed by his initial assumptions about Sarah's background and qualifications. Sarah stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same authority Marcus had noticed earlier, but now he understood where it came from. "Sergeant Thompson, would you be interested in learning more about advanced training methods?" she asked. "Your background and experience might make you a good candidate for some of the programs we're developing." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The demonstration on the mat had shown him capabilities he had never imagined possible, and the thought of learning those techniques was immediately appealing. "What would that involve?" he asked. "Additional training beyond your current duties," the Master Chief explained. "Specialized instruction in areas that might enhance your effectiveness and the effectiveness of soldiers under your command." It was an opportunity that Marcus hadn't seen coming, emerging from what had started as a confrontation about training standards and instructor qualifications. The irony wasn't lost on him that his challenge to Sarah's credentials might lead to his own advancement in areas he hadn't known existed. As he looked at Sarah with new eyes, Marcus realized that everything about this morning had been a learning experience. His assumptions about civilian contractors and training standards had been challenged, his understanding of military capabilities had been expanded, and his respect for the complexity of modern military operations had been deepened. "I'm interested," he said, though he suspected that accepting this opportunity would lead him down a path very different from the traditional military career he had planned. 3 weeks later, Marcus found himself standing in a nondescript building 20 miles from the main base, wearing civilian clothes and carrying credentials that identified him as a contractor rather than active military personnel. The Master Chief's invitation had led to a series of interviews, psychological evaluations, and background checks that went far beyond anything Marcus had experienced in his previous military service. The room he entered looked nothing like a traditional military training facility. Instead of the standard government-issued equipment and institutional color scheme he was used to, this space resembled a high-end private gym combined with a research laboratory. Advanced computer systems monitored biometric data, and training equipment included devices Marcus didn't recognize alongside modified versions of familiar tools. Sarah was waiting for him, but she looked different than she had during their first encounter. Gone was the standard PT uniform, replaced by tactical clothing that suggested someone prepared for immediate deployment to unknown situations. Her demeanor had also changed, projecting the kind of focused intensity Marcus associated with pre-mission briefings. "Welcome to the Advanced Combat Training Initiative," she said, gesturing for him to take a seat at a conference table in one corner of the room. "What you're about to learn is classified above your current clearance level, but your participation in this program temporarily elevates your access to information on a need-to-know basis." Marcus sat down, trying to process the implications of what she had just told him. In his decade of military service, he had held secret clearance for various operations, but this suggested something beyond normal classification levels. "What exactly is this program?" he asked. Sarah opened a folder containing documents that were heavily redacted but still visible enough for Marcus to see references to psychological profiles combat effectiveness studies, and operational statistic for missions he had never heard of. The simple answer is that we prepare military personnel for scenarios that fall outside normal tactical parameters, she explained. The complex answer is that modern threats require capabilities that traditional training methods can't provide. She showed him photographs of training exercises that looked unlike anything from his own military experience. Soldiers were practicing techniques that seemed to blend martial arts, psychological manipulation, and improvised problem-solving in ways that challenged every assumption Marcus had about military operations. These soldiers are learning to operate independently in hostile environments where they can't rely on backup, standard equipment, or conventional tactics, Sarah continued. They might be inserted into civilian populations where they need to blend in while gathering intelligence. They might face enemies who use psychological warfare, drugged combatants who don't respond to normal pain compliance techniques, or situations where lethal force isn't authorized but neutralization is still required. Marcus studied the photographs more closely, beginning to understand the complexity of what he was seeing. The techniques being demonstrated weren't just about physical combat. They involved elements of acting, psychology, improvised engineering, and cultural adaptation that went far beyond traditional soldier training. "How many people know about this program?" he asked. "Fewer than you might think," Sarah replied. The soldiers who participate return to their regular units with enhanced capabilities, but without discussing the source of their training. From the outside, it looks like they've simply become more effective at their existing duties. It was an elegant system, Marcus realized. Enhanced capabilities without the security risks that would come from widespread knowledge of specialized training programs. Soldiers became more effective without creating obvious patterns that enemies could identify and counteract. "Why was I selected for this?" Marcus asked, though he suspected the answer might relate to his confrontation with Sarah 3 weeks earlier. "Your psychological profile indicates someone who values traditional military standards but is also capable of adapting when presented with new information," Sarah explained. "Your combat experience provides a foundation of real-world knowledge, and your leadership potential suggests someone who could eventually train others in these methods." She slid another document across the table, this one containing what appeared to be a detailed analysis of Marcus's military record, including assessments of incidents he had never discussed with anyone. "You've already demonstrated improvisational problem-solving under extreme stress," she continued. "The firefight outside Kandahar, where you improvised explosive devices from available materials. The hostage situation in Mosul, where you used psychological pressure to force a surrender without casualties. The patrol in the Hindu Kush, where you successfully navigated cultural sensitivities to gain intelligence from local civilians." Marcus was stunned. The incidents she mentioned were ones he remembered vividly, but he had never thought of them as examples of anything other than standard combat problem-solving. Seeing them analyzed and cataloged as demonstrations of special capabilities was both flattering and somewhat unsettling. "Those are just doing my job," he said. "Exactly," Sarah replied, "which is why you're here. Most soldiers can follow procedures and execute standard tactics. Some soldiers can adapt those tactics to unusual circumstances. Very few soldiers can consistently develop entirely new approaches when standard procedures aren't sufficient." She stood and walked toward the training area, gesturing for Marcus to follow. As they moved through the facility, she pointed out various pieces of equipment and explained their purposes. "This section focuses on psychological manipulation and social engineering," she said, indicating an area that looked like a movie set with multiple room configurations. "Soldiers practice blending into different cultural environments, assuming false identities, and extracting information from unwilling subjects without using physical coercion." They passed another area where soldiers were practicing combat techniques that incorporated elements Marcus didn't recognize. The movements were fluid and precise, but they seemed to be designed for situations where traditional fighting methods wouldn't be effective. "Close-quarters combat for non-standard scenarios," Sarah explained. "Fighting in confined spaces, neutralizing opponents without causing permanent injury. defending against weapons that aren't commonly encountered, and subduing targets who may be under the influence of drugs or psychological conditioning. Marcus watched the training exercises with growing fascination. Everything he was seeing challenged his understanding of what modern military operations required, but it also made perfect sense when he considered the complexity of contemporary global conflicts. "How long does the training take?" he asked. "That depends on the individual and their intended role," Sarah replied. "Basic certification requires 6 months of intensive training. Advanced specialization can take up to 2 years. Master instructor level, which is what I represent, typically requires 5 years of combined training and operational experience." They reached a section of the facility that was secured behind additional access controls. Sarah used multiple authentication methods to enter, suggesting that whatever was beyond this point represented an even higher level of classification. "This is where we develop new techniques and test experimental training methods," she explained as they entered what looked like a combination laboratory, workshop, and simulation center. Computer systems were running complex scenarios that appeared to model everything from urban combat situations to diplomatic negotiations. Soldiers were participating in virtual reality exercises that seemed to place them in incredibly realistic hostile environments. "The goal is to expose trainees to the widest possible range of challenging scenarios before they encounter them in real operations," Sarah continued. "We can simulate psychological pressure, physical stress, cultural confusion, equipment failure, and tactical disadvantage in controlled conditions where failure is a learning opportunity rather than a life-threatening situation." Marcus was beginning to understand the scope and sophistication of what he was being offered. This wasn't just advanced military training. It was a comprehensive program for developing human capabilities beyond normal limits. "What's the success rate?" he asked. Sarah's expression became more serious. "Define success," she said. "If you mean completion of the training program, about 60% of candidates finish the basic certification. If you mean effective performance in operational situations, our graduates have a significantly higher survival rate and mission success rate than soldiers with conventional training." She showed him statistical analyses that demonstrated the effectiveness of the program's graduates across multiple metrics. Reduced casualty rates, higher mission completion percentages, improved adaptability to unexpected circumstances, and enhanced leadership effectiveness. "But there are costs," Sarah continued. "This training changes people. It has to, in order to be effective. Soldiers who complete this program often find it difficult to return to conventional military environments. They see problems and solutions that others miss, and they may become frustrated with standard procedures that seem inadequate." It was an honest assessment that Marcus appreciated. The opportunity being offered clearly had significant benefits, but it also came with consequences that would affect his entire military career. "What happened to you?" Marcus asked. "How did you end up in this role?" For the first time since their initial confrontation, Sarah seemed genuinely surprised by a question. She looked at him for a long moment before deciding how to respond. "I was recruited out of the Navy 8 years ago after completing SEAL training," she said. "At the time, I was one of the first women to successfully complete the program, which created both opportunities and challenges that normal career progression couldn't address." She gestured toward the training facility around them. This program offered a way to contribute to military effectiveness without dealing with the political complications of traditional unit assignments. It also provided access to training methods and operational opportunities that weren't available through conventional career paths. Marcus could hear both satisfaction and regret in her voice. The opportunity had clearly been beneficial for her professional development, but it had also taken her away from the traditional military career she had originally planned. "Do you miss regular unit assignments?" he asked. "Sometimes," she admitted. "There's something to be said for the camaraderie and shared purpose of traditional military units. This work can be isolating, and the secrecy requirements make it difficult to maintain normal relationships with other military personnel." They had reached the center of the facility where a small group of soldiers were engaged in what appeared to be a complex team exercise. Marcus watched them work through a scenario that seemed to require simultaneous use of technical skills, cultural knowledge, psychological manipulation, and physical capabilities. That exercise simulates a hostage rescue in a foreign embassy where the hostage-takers are using child soldiers as human shields, Sarah explained. The team has to neutralize the threat without harming the children, while navigating diplomatic protocols and cultural sensitivities that could affect international relations for years afterward. Marcus studied the exercise more carefully, beginning to appreciate the complexity of what the team was attempting. Every decision had multiple consequences, and success required capabilities that went far beyond traditional military training. How often do situations like this actually occur? He asked. More often than the public realizes, Sarah replied. Modern conflicts rarely involve traditional armies fighting conventional battles. Our people are more likely to encounter situations that require diplomatic skills, cultural expertise, psychological insight, and creative problem-solving than scenarios where superior firepower is the determining factor. As they watched the exercise continue, Marcus found himself analyzing the team's approach and identifying alternative strategies. Without realizing it, he was already beginning to think like someone trained for these types of operations. You're processing this scenario tactically, Sarah observed, apparently noticing his focus on the exercise. That's a good sign. Most people watch these simulations as observers, but you're already starting to think like a participant. She was right, Marcus realized. Instead of simply watching the exercise as a demonstration, he was unconsciously developing his own approach to the challenges the team was facing. His mind was already working through alternative strategies and tactical modifications. What's the next step? He asked. Sarah smiled, and Marcus recognized it as the same expression she had worn just before their physical demonstration 3 weeks earlier. The next step is to find out whether you're as adaptable as your psychological profile suggests, she said. Before Marcus could ask what she meant, alarms began sounding throughout the facility. Red lights started flashing, and the training exercises immediately stopped as all personnel moved toward designated positions. This isn't a drill, Sarah said, her voice taking on the same command authority Marcus had heard during their first encounter. We've got a real-world situation developing, and you're about to get a first-hand look at why this training exists. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he followed Sarah toward what appeared to be a command center. Around them, the soldiers who had been participating in training exercises were rapidly transforming into an operational team, preparing for immediate deployment. What kind of situation? Marcus asked. The kind that doesn't wait for convenient timing, Sarah replied. Welcome to Advanced Combat Training, Sergeant Thompson. Let's see how quickly you can adapt to circumstances you never trained for. The command center erupted into controlled chaos as Sarah led Marcus toward a bank of monitors displaying real-time intelligence feeds from around the globe. Military personnel moved with practiced efficiency, transforming the training facility into an active operational headquarters within minutes. Situation report, Sarah called out as they approached the central communications console. A Navy Lieutenant Commander Marcus didn't recognize looked up from a secure terminal. We've got a hostage situation at the American consulate in Diyarbakir, Turkey. Unknown number of armed hostiles have taken approximately 30 civilians, including 5 American embassy personnel. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Hostage situations were among the most challenging scenarios military personnel could face, requiring perfect coordination between intelligence, negotiation, and tactical teams. Local response capabilities? Sarah asked, studying satellite imagery on the main screen. Turkish special forces are establishing a perimeter, but they've requested American assistance due to the complexity of the situation, the lieutenant commander replied. Intelligence suggests the hostiles may be using chemical restraints on the hostages, which complicates conventional rescue approaches. Sarah nodded, and Marcus could see her mind already working through operational possibilities. Around them, other personnel were gathering equipment and preparing briefing materials with the kind of efficiency that came from extensive practice. "What's our response timeline?" she asked. "Transport wheels up in 90 minutes, came the reply. Team insertion approximately 6 hours after that, assuming diplomatic clearances come through as expected. Marcus watched in fascination as Sarah immediately transitioned from training instructor to operational commander. Her entire demeanor changed, projecting the kind of decisive authority he had seen in the most effective leaders during his own combat deployments. Team composition, she continued. The lieutenant commander handed her a tablet displaying personnel files. Standard hostage rescue configuration, but modified for chemical restraint scenarios. We're including medical support and psychological specialists in addition to tactical personnel. Sarah reviewed the files quickly, then looked at Marcus with an expression that suggested she was making a significant decision. Sergeant Thompson will be joining this operation as an observer, she announced. The declaration sent a shock through Marcus's system. He had expected to spend weeks or months training before participating in any real operations, not to be thrust immediately into a complex international incident. "Ma'am, I haven't completed any of the specialized training," Marcus protested. "I'm not qualified for this level of operation." Sarah's response challenged everything Marcus thought he understood about military preparation and qualifications. "Sergeant, you've been in more hostile fire situations than half this team," she said. "You have practical experience in urban combat, hostage situations, and cultural navigation in Middle Eastern environments. What you lack in specialized techniques, you compensate for with proven adaptability under extreme stress." She gestured toward the intelligence displays showing the consulate building and surrounding area. "This operation requires someone who can think independently when standard procedures don't apply. Based on your service record and our evaluation, you're exactly the kind of person we need for unpredictable situations." Marcus looked around the command center, taking in the faces of personnel who would be depending on him to perform effectively in circumstances he had never trained for. The responsibility was both terrifying and inspiring. "What will my role be?" he asked. "Adaptive problem solving," Sarah replied. "During complex operations, unexpected challenges always arise that require immediate solutions. Your job would be to identify problems that the specialists might miss and develop approaches that our standard protocols don't cover." It was a role that played to Marcus's strengths while acknowledging his limitations, but it also placed him in a position where failure could have catastrophic consequences for both the team and the hostages they were trying to rescue. The next 90 minutes passed in a blur of briefings, equipment preparation, and rapid-fire intelligence updates. Marcus found himself equipped with gear he had never used and learning communication protocols that were far more sophisticated than anything from his previous military experience. Sarah personally oversaw his preparation, ensuring that he understood not just the technical aspects of the equipment, but the psychological and tactical considerations that would affect his decision-making during the operation. "Remember," she told him as they prepared to board the transport aircraft, "this isn't about proving anything or demonstrating your capabilities. This is about contributing to a successful mission in whatever way the situation requires." The flight to Turkey gave Marcus time to study the operational plans and intelligence reports more thoroughly. What he learned reinforced his understanding of how complex modern military operations had become. The hostage takers weren't traditional terrorists or criminals. Intelligence suggested they were former military personnel from multiple countries who had been radicalized through exposure to experimental psychological conditioning techniques. They were using chemical agents to keep hostages compliant, but they were also demonstrating tactical awareness that suggested professional training. "This is exactly the kind of situation our training program was designed to address," Sarah explained during the flight. "Traditional hostage rescue assumes predictable behavior patterns from both hostiles and hostages. When those assumptions don't apply, conventional tactics often fail." Marcus studied floor plans of the consulate building, trying to understand the tactical challenges the team would face. The structure had been designed for diplomatic functions, not defensive operations, which created both vulnerabilities and unexpected opportunities. "What's our primary advantage?" he asked. "Adaptability," Sarah replied without hesitation. "The hostiles are probably prepared for conventional assault tactics and standard negotiation approaches. They're less likely to be prepared for techniques they've never encountered before." As their aircraft began its descent toward the staging area, Marcus felt the familiar pre-combat mixture of anxiety and focused determination. But this time, the feelings were complicated by uncertainty about his role and qualifications for the mission ahead. The staging area was a Turkish military base that had been temporarily converted into a joint operational headquarters. American, Turkish, and international personnel worked alongside each other with the kind of professional cooperation that Marcus associated with the most serious military operations. Sarah immediately integrated with the command structure, receiving updates and contributing to tactical planning with an ease that demonstrated her experience in these types of situations. Marcus found himself assigned to an intelligence analysis team, where his combat experience helped interpret reconnaissance data in ways that pure technical analysis might miss. "The hostiles have positioned themselves to funnel any rescue attempt through predetermined kill zones," Marcus observed, studying updated floor plans and surveillance footage. "But they've also created escape routes that could work against them if we can force them to move in specific directions." His analysis caught the attention of the operational planning team, who incorporated his observations into their tactical approach. For the first time since joining this mission, Marcus felt that he was contributing valuable insights rather than simply observing. As the operation moved into its final planning phase, Sarah pulled Marcus aside for a private conversation. "I want you to understand something about what you're participating in today," she said. "This isn't just a hostage rescue. This is a test of capabilities that could determine how our military handles similar situations in the future." She showed him classified reports describing similar incidents around the world, all involving hostiles who were using unconventional tactics that challenged traditional military responses. The techniques we're about to employ have been developed through years of research and training, but they've never been tested in a scenario exactly like this one, she continued. "Your role is to provide real-time assessment of their effectiveness and identify modifications that might be needed." Marcus began to understand that his participation in this operation was both more and less significant than he had initially thought. He wasn't expected to perform at the level of the specialized team members, but his observations and insights could influence how future operations were planned and executed. The insertion phase of the operation proceeded flawlessly. The team infiltrated the consulate building using techniques that Marcus had never seen before, bypassing security measures and hostile positions through approaches that seemed to violate basic assumptions about building layout and defensive positioning. Once inside, Marcus witnessed the practical application of the training methods he had only briefly observed at the facility. Team members used psychological manipulation to confuse and disorient the hostiles, employed chemical countermeasures to neutralize the agents affecting the hostages, and demonstrated combat techniques that allowed them to neutralize threats without endangering civilians. But the operation also revealed limitations in their preparation. The hostiles were more adaptable than intelligence had suggested, and they employed countermeasures that forced the team to modify their approach in real time. "They're using standard special operations tactics against us," Marcus reported over the communication network. "They've studied our conventional methods and prepared specifically to counter them." His observation prompted Sarah to authorize implementation of experimental techniques that hadn't been planned for this operation. The team began employing psychological warfare methods, improvisational engineering solutions, and cultural manipulation tactics that confused and overwhelmed the hostiles' prepared defenses. The critical moment came when the team encountered a situation that none of their training had specifically prepared them for. The hostiles had rigged the building with explosives that were designed to detonate if any hostage was moved, but they had also positioned those same hostages in locations that made it impossible to neutralize the explosive threats. Standard protocols say we abort and try a different approach, the team leader reported. But intelligence indicates the hostiles are planning to execute the hostages at sunrise regardless of our actions. Marcus found himself in the position he had been prepared for, but had hoped not to encounter. The operation required a solution that didn't exist in any manual or training program. Drawing on his combat experience, his understanding of the building layout, and his assessment of the hostile's psychological state, Marcus proposed a course of action that challenged every conventional assumption about hostage rescue operations. What if we give them what they think they want, he suggested. The proposal was radical and risky, but it offered a path to mission success that conventional approaches couldn't provide. Sarah authorized implementation of Marcus's plan, despite the fact that it required team members to expose themselves to significant personal risk. What followed was a complex psychological operation that used the hostiles' own expectations and prepared responses against them. The team convinced the hostiles that their demands were being met while simultaneously positioning themselves to neutralize all threats simultaneously. The operation concluded successfully, with all hostages rescued and all hostiles captured without casualties on either side. But more important than the tactical success was what the operation revealed about the effectiveness of non-conventional training methods. During the post-operation debriefing, Marcus found himself in the unusual position of being asked to evaluate the performance of personnel with far more specialized training than his own. The techniques worked, he reported, but their real value was in providing alternatives when standard approaches weren't sufficient. The team's ability to adapt and improvise was what made the difference. Sarah nodded, apparently satisfied with both the operation's outcome and Marcus's assessment of it. This is why the program exists, she told him. Modern threats require capabilities that traditional military training can't provide. Today's operation demonstrated that our approach can be effective, but it also showed areas where further development is needed. As they prepared to return to the United States, Marcus reflected on everything that had changed since his confrontation with Sarah 6 weeks earlier. He had begun that morning convinced that military standards were being compromised by unqualified civilians. He was ending this mission with a completely different understanding of what military excellence required. What happens next? Marcus asked Sarah as they boarded the return flight. That depends on what you want to happen, she replied. You've demonstrated that you can contribute effectively to operations at this level. The question is whether you want to commit to the training and lifestyle that goes with it. Marcus thought about the traditional military career he had planned, with its predictable progression through ranks and increasing responsibilities within established structures. Then, he considered the alternative path that had been revealed to him, with its emphasis on developing capabilities that most people couldn't imagine. How long do I have to decide, he asked. Sarah smiled, and Marcus recognized it as the expression she had worn throughout their various encounters, suggesting knowledge of outcomes that weren't yet apparent to others. Take all the time you need, she said, but understand that opportunities like this don't wait for convenient timing. As the aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude, Marcus looked out at the landscape below and considered the choice he was facing. His confrontation with Sarah had begun with his challenge to her qualifications and credentials. It was ending with her offering him the opportunity to develop qualifications and credentials he had never imagined possible. The irony wasn't lost on him that his insistence on maintaining military standards had led to his discovery of standards far higher than anything he had previously known existed. His attack on what he had perceived as a lowering of requirements had revealed training programs that pushed human capabilities beyond normal limits. 6 weeks later, Marcus Thompson began the Advanced Combat Training Initiative program as a full-time student. His transformation from a traditional soldier questioning civilian instructors to a specialist developing unconventional military capabilities would take years to complete. But on that aircraft returning from Turkey, he had already learned the most important lesson the program had to offer. True military excellence required the humility to recognize that there was always more to learn and the courage to pursue capabilities that pushed beyond comfortable assumptions about what was possible. Sarah Mitchell continued to serve as the primary instructor for advanced combat specialists, her methods proven effective through operations like the one Marcus had participated in. Her background remained classified, her techniques continued to evolve, and her impact on military effectiveness grew with each soldier she trained. The confrontation that had begun with Marcus's attack on her credentials had ended with his recognition that the highest military standards weren't about maintaining familiar traditions, but about constantly developing new capabilities to meet emerging challenges. In the world of modern military operations, the most dangerous assumption was that yesterday's training would be sufficient for tomorrow's threats. Sarah Mitchell's program ensured that assumption would never compromise the effectiveness of the soldiers. She prepared for missions that existed beyond conventional military imagination.